Good morning, everyone. My name is Gina Wen. I'm SMID-cap biotech analyst from Barclays. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Tom Kassberg, Chief Business Officer of Ultragenyx.
Thanks, Gina. Let me figure out the slides. So I'm Tom Kassberg, Chief Business Officer at Ultragenyx, and I'm pleased to be here to talk to you about Ultragenyx today. So our standard legal warning for the presentation to follow. So Ultragenyx, for some of you, I'll give you a quick introduction, was founded in 2010, went IPO in 2014, and we talk about it as a company that was built rare by design. So from the beginning, developed as a specialist rare disease company. We have, in terms of, we forged many new approaches and with multiple modalities that we currently employ to address these rare diseases. About a year and a half ago, we added a gene therapy platform, which is now an important component of our valuation. We have 6+ programs and a strong manufacturing base that came along with that acquisition. We're also a big transition year in 2018. We became a global commercial company. We have 2 approved therapies, and we have another one that we're filing for in 2019. And we're present in a number of countries marketing these products. This represents our global commercial presence with the 2 approved products. Crysvita is a product that we have in essentially the Western Hemisphere, so North America, South America, and then with Mepsevii, we also have Europe. And I mentioned the 3rd submission that we're planning in the U.S. now for UX007 for long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders. So the company has founded on sort of deep understanding of genetic diseases and how to develop drugs for those diseases. We started off with fairly more traditional approaches in terms of modality being biologics and small molecule. Those are sort of a lower risk way to think about how to get into rare diseases, and that's where we started. Over time, we've added other modalities, first with mRNA, which we did through partnership, and then, as I mentioned, we added gene therapy through acquisition of Dimension Therapeutics. The goal really is to have, initially, we had a set of modalities, but then as we added modalities, the purpose was to be able to treat rare diseases that might otherwise be difficult to treat. And if you look at the bottom, it represents the different both clinical and research pipeline. I'll talk more about our clinical pipeline. In the research side, we have, which we don't talk about as much, about 14 different projects, and I believe we'll also talk more about some of the efforts we have on the earlier side in research at our Analyst Day in April. So talk briefly about the clinical pipeline, starting with Crysvita. It's a monoclonal antibody against FGF23. It's approved in XLH. We have a phase 2 study ongoing in TIO, and we're looking for, hoping to be able to file on that phase 2 data in terms of the TIO indication. We have approved product Mepsevii, which is an enzyme replacement therapy for MPS VII. UX007, I mentioned, it's a small molecule substrate replacement therapy for long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders. We are in discussions, have been in discussions with the FDA, have a path to filing, and we're preparing that filing for mid-year this year. The bottom 3 programs is our gene therapy pipeline. When we acquired Dimension Therapeutics, they had 2 products in the clinic. We'll talk more about those, DTX301 and DTX401 for OTC and GSD1A respectively. And then we have another product which is with a partner, Bayer. It's AAV factor 8 for hemophilia A, and that's in phase 1. So I mentioned beyond that, we have 14 translational research programs, and I should say our goal as a company is to file, to have a product in the clinic every 1 to 2 years. And actually for 2020, we'll probably have 2 to 3 programs if all those things advance. So near-term commercial and clinical catalysts. So for Mepsevii and Crysvita, our 2 commercial products, we'll have commercial updates as we go through the year. mostly on a quarterly basis, so you'll hear updates as we go through the year. TIO, I mentioned that we are finalizing registration plan for TIO based on the phase 2, and we'll have an update probably in the second half of the year. FAOD, we have discussed the long-term extension data in the first half in terms of an update on that, and we're planning an NDA submission mid-year this year. Then the next two programs, the OTC deficiency, we'll have additional data from cohort 3 about mid-year. So we've released data on the first 2 cohorts. We have 3 more patients in cohort 3 around mid-year. And then for 401, for GSD1A, we'll have cohort 2 data also around the same time, mid-year. So a brief commercial update. Again, this just shows our global commercial presence for Crysvita. We're approved in Canada and U.S. In Europe, also approved. Our partner, KHK, has the product in Europe. And we have pending decisions in Switzerland and Turkey and some named patient business there. Latin America, a number of countries, either named patient or pending decisions. We've announced that we've filed in Brazil and Colombia, so we hope to get those approvals, and we have named patient sales in Argentina. And Mepsevii we have globally, as I mentioned, and we're rolling out those countries, approved in U.S., Europe, also Brazil and other countries to follow. So talk a little bit about our U.S. Commercial strategy for Crysvita. We believe, a fairly unique structure in terms of how we go to market and how we support patients in the U.S. On the left, you see the patient diagnosis liaison. So that's a team of 30 people. That team was actually put together a year before launch, and they call on doctors with XLH patients. Initially, they were not, and still today, they don't talk about product. They're helping identify patients, which can then be handed off to what we call the UltraCare liaisons, essentially field representatives, who then work with the physician to get a patient that's appropriate onto therapy. On the far right, you see the UltraCare guides. That's our term for essentially a patient hub. Sometimes that's outsourced at Ultragenyx. We view that as a critical activity, and we have an internal team of 10 people. We'll probably grow that this year. So they help with reimbursement, getting patients on therapy. We're also supported by about 10 MSLs, sort of traditional medical science liaisons in the U.S. So strong U.S. launch so far. We've been updating on this, but we're really pleased with how this is going. Some metrics we have, this is as of the end of 2018. We have greater than 900 completed start forms, so that's an initiation of therapy that comes from a physician. And in fourth quarter, about 4 out of 5 patients were naive, so not from the clinical program and rollover. These are patients that we found and moving to therapy. And I think interestingly as well, 400 unique prescribers. So I think that shows the potential for future growth. So 400 different physicians prescribing or writing start forms that you see. So that means that each of these physicians maybe is doing, typical physician may only have 1 or 2 patients that they're initiated with start forms. They should have many more patients, so that's the potential for growth. We have 550 patients at the end of the year on reimbursed commercial therapy, and we have very good coverage in terms of the policies now, greater than 200 million covered lives. Most of those are very close, in terms of policies, very close to the labeled indication, don't differentiate between peds and adults. Should also point out the mix, because I think that was something we've been following. About 40% of the start forms are for adult and 60% for pediatrics. So we've been very pleased with the number of adult patients that are interested in therapy, because that was sort of a question, is can you find these adults and would they be good candidates for treatment? And so far the answer is yes in many cases. The launch has been supported by some additional clinical data that we've presented and come forward. Most recently, we had additional 64-week data showing substantial rickets healing. This is in the phase 3 pediatric, which is compared against conventional therapy. So this really establishes Crysvita as the best therapy for pediatrics. It's very clear from the data that patients really should be put onto this therapy in terms of, particularly the pediatrics. In the adult, we also had released additional data, I believe it's 48 weeks, showing substantial fracture healing, and also have more data now on improvements in symptoms, stiffness, pain, physical functioning, for example. So this has all been data that's come in after launch, and we're planning to file this data also for expansion of label. So one question we often get is, we have a partner, KHK, how does that work? It's a complicated deal. Actually, I was involved in doing the deal. You see then the 3 different territories. This is just to show, yes, there's a transition after 5 years where our partner, KHK, will take over the majority of the commercial responsibilities. But in terms of revenue and in terms of profit, it's really a smooth line. There's a switch from a profit share to a royalty, but in terms of the effect to Ultragenyx, it's really, they're very equivalent to one another is what we expect. Latin America, it's our product, and there's no change over the course of the collaboration. We retain that and the revenue grows. And in Europe, we say, we've disclosed it's a royalty of up to 10%, so again, that's steady throughout the collaboration term. So I'm going to switch and talk briefly about 007, long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders. This is a very serious disease with a high level of mortality. Patients have an inability to convert fat into energy and have a number of crises that result from that. UX007 now in a number of different studies, we've been able to show, can have a significant impact on this disease. And I guess we took out, there originally was some data. I won't go through the data, but maybe I should just talk to it here. We are planning to have an NDA submission. There's a number of components to that now that we feel pretty confident or optimistic that we'll be able to file this data and we'll have a successful review with the FDA. There's a company-sponsored phase 2 that we also have in an extension study. So there were 29 patients. There are now total, in the original phase 2, is now a total of 75 patients in the extension study, and we have some other data, investigator-sponsored data, retrospective medical data that will also be part of that filing. So switch and talk about gene therapy. As I mentioned, these programs originally derived from our acquisition of Dimension Therapeutics. We have the 3 clinical programs we discussed, and we added at the bottom there, I'll talk briefly about it. Wilson's disease is a program that Dimension originally had, but we're now accelerating that. We think that's a great fit for gene therapy, and we're pressing ahead to try to get that to the clinic as soon as possible. Just a note on what we acquired with Dimension. Yes, there were programs and intellectual property and other know-how, but an important component was actually the manufacturing. We think that's going to be critical in gene therapy field. And so they have very robust systems to both develop processes for manufacturing in mammalian cell systems, both HEK293 and HeLa cell. HeLa cell is particularly important, the PCL method, in terms of being able to scale to 2,000 liter, which we've actually done with our partner Bayer with Heme, and we're moving other programs to this system. Talk about 301, AAV8 for OTC deficiency. OTC deficiency is an X-linked, it's a urea-cycle disorder. There's a defect in ammonia detoxification. So patients with this disease end up with high levels of ammonia. Ammonia then leads to a number of adverse cognitive and neurological effects, among other things. Currently treated with ammonia scavengers, and we are now in the clinic for the gene therapy approach. I'm going to show data from, so we have treated now 6 patients and released data on 6 patients. We have 2 responders that are essentially cured in the study. So 1 out of 3 in each cohort. I'll show this is the data for cohort 1, patient 1, which is now out to 1 year. So you can see, it's hard to see from here, but the purple line is the % of normal. It's a measure of ureagenesis. So we're able to get to 170 at the end now at the 52-week period where we've disclosed about 170% of normal. So effectively, this patient now has been above normal rate of ureagenesis. So essentially, they've been able to, actually this occurred the 24-week period, liberalize their diet. They're on a restricted diet as well as off the medications, the ammonia scavenger medication. So essentially a cure for this patient, which has been very exciting to see. Second patient, data through 24 weeks, also achieved 100% of normal now at 24 weeks, is also off the protein-restricted diet and also off medication. So essentially, again, a cure, 2 out of 6 patients. So just a note, where we're going with that program is, so we've completed or enrolled 2 cohorts. We're now moving to a 3rd cohort. We're going to increase the dose to 1E13, and we're currently enrolling that cohort 3, and we'll have data mid-year. Moving to 401, which is AV8 for GSD1A. So GSD1A is inborn error of glucose metabolism. So these patients have hypoglycemic episodes. They're unable to release glucose into the bloodstream the way normal people would do because of this deficient glucose 6-phosphatase. It's a very severe disease. And basically you can see in the picture on the right, it's currently treated or managed with daily cornstarch consumption. So that's a child, and in front of that child is 6 glasses of cornstarch, and that's what they would take on a daily basis in order to maintain an appropriate level of glucose. It helps with the hypoglycemia, but there's other pathology that's not treated by this treatment. So gene therapy is, we think, a very strong approach in this disease. So we've had data now. We've continued clinical response. We've treated first cohort, and we've had data now out to 24 weeks. We initially released data on 12 weeks. And essentially the effects have been sustained at 24 weeks. Time to hypoglycemia has been maintained or further increased. And they've reached normal glucose levels. This is all 3 patients responded, had a clinical response, and all 3 patients were able to reduce their use of cornstarch. I think it's between 50 and, I'll have a slide in a minute, 50 and 70% reduction in cornstarch. So we're currently enrolling cohort 2, and it's at the next higher dose, 6E12, and data mid-year on that second cohort. So these are the 3 patients that you can see here. I mentioned in all 3 patients, the reduction in the use of cornstarch. You can see the different patients. Patient 1 and 2 had the best response. Patient 3 also responded. Sort of the blue line is the time that they can go. It's a glucose fasting test, so it's the time that they can go without having additional feed or glucose. So, and the idea is that patients right now, they can't sleep through the night. They have to be woken up by their parents if it's a child to take their cornstarch. So the idea is to try to get them to be able to go through the night, for example. And you can see in some cases, like patient number 2, up to 13 hours through this glucose fasting test. So all 3 patients responded, strong response in first 2, now going to, this was at the low dose, now going to a higher dose in cohort 2. And the safety that we've seen in this has been very good. Mild asymptomatic elevation ALT that's been successfully managed with steroids, and really no other serious adverse events. So lastly, on the gene therapy, Wilson's disease, I mentioned this is our next clinical program. Wilson's disease is a disease where copper accumulates in the liver, brain, and other vital organs. They're missing a copper pump, so they're unable to pump copper out of particularly the liver, leads to a whole bunch of serious symptoms. The standard of care is chelation therapy and dietary restriction, but even with these therapies, many patients still experience a lot of clinical problems. It's a larger prevalent population. We believe around 50,000 patients, so a good opportunity both from a medical clinical perspective as well as commercial. And lastly, just a couple slides, financial overview. So we, in 2018, we had total revenues of about $50 million. About $19 million of that was related or was Crysvita revenue. We ended cash about $460 million at the end of 2018, but then we had proceeds from a recent financing. Additional $330 million was raised in March. So that's in addition to the cash we ended the year with. Cash used in operations is about $290 million in 2018. So you can see then how far that cash potentially could last us. And we don't have any debt at the company. So continued commercial and clinical momentum. If summarize sort of the, where we are. Global commercial growth has really been important. We established our global commercial presence. We have 2 approved products, hopefully a third to follow. Our gene therapy programs have progressed nicely. We have proof of concept in 2 indications. We're driving on Wilson's disease, and we've also successfully established large-scale manufacturing, 2,000 liter, with our partner for our partner program with Bayer. And so we think we're well along the way developing an exceptional rare disease company at Ultragenyx. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. So maybe, I know we don't have too much time left for questions. We will save the majority of questions at the breakout session across the hall. So maybe now I just ask you quickly, I think Crysvita, is one of the launch, seems very impressive. Can you just share with us, what do you think is the major drivers there? And where do you see, do you see those change in the next few quarters?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the major drivers is just the clinical efficacy of the product. I think it's been really well received by physicians and patients. It's really a tremendous new therapy for XLH. I think in terms of the commercial adoption and success, we think the PDL, the patient diagnosis liaisons, that's been really critical to the launch trajectory. So we had 30 PDLs, as we call them, out in the field a year before launch, identifying physicians who have patients. And I think that's probably not a typical approach, but it's one that's, I think, been very successful for us. So now, as you saw, we have 400 and some physicians already writing prescriptions with potentially many more patients in those practices. And as they gain experience, we think you'll see repeat writing and new patients coming from that. We're continuing that strong effort, but I think if you also look at that continuum, I think it's really important to think about all the aspects of supporting reimbursement, supporting the physician, and we have all those elements within the company. I think the adoption's been very strong in the pediatric, as you'd expect. One of the challenges is to, continue to find adult patients and to get them on therapy, and I think we're making good progress there. We're looking at, different new approaches this year, including a pedigree approach where we'll help, through genetic counseling, help patients understand their family history and perhaps, identify additional patients that way. Those are some of the factors, though, I think that have helped us.
Okay. And then just another quick question regarding launching FLD. So NDA filing, expected by mid-19, right? Do you expect any AdCom? And also, another question is, given this is ultra-rare indications, right? Global is only like 2,000-3,000 U.S. patients, right? So what should we think about pricing? Okay.
So on the AdCom, I think we'll know about 60 days after, I think, the FDA interaction. So we'll know if we need an AdCom, I think, sometime in the next few months. But so we don't know, but I think if we have an AdCom, I think we'd welcome it. I think it'd be a good opportunity to get that expert panel to discuss this product. Sorry, your second question, Gina, was around
the pricing.
Pricing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I can't comment specifically really on pricing. I know that I can say a couple things. One is that there are a few factors. It's not as rare as something like MPS VII. Let's say you mentioned 2,000 to 3,000 patients. So, I would expect from just the prevalence will be an important factor in considering where this should be priced. The other factor is, what are the other therapies that are out there? Yes, this is a transformative therapy, we believe, for patients, but they're currently treated with MCT. That's a medical food product. It's typically paid out of pocket. It's a few $1,000s per year for patients. But we need to consider that. That's currently what they're being treated with, so that'll factor into it. So I think it'll be, not priced in the $300,000 per patient per year kind of range. It's more likely to be, on a lower range than that. I'm not sure I can say specifically, but I think where analysts have it currently is between $60,000 and $100,000. That's probably, a reasonable estimation of that, but we haven't provided any more guidance.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And we will have a breakout session across the hall. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina.
Thank you.